Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the coupon code is HORROR, and it's good for 10% off any order of $10 or more, and it's going to run from October the 12th through November the 11th. That's right, our friends at Noble Knight hooked up a killer code for Halloween, and it's called HORROR. So put that in to get your discount code of 10% off any order of $10 or more, either online or if you're lucky enough to walk through those beautiful doors in person. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, but Hambone, I have so many games on my shelf that I don't know if I have any room for more games. Well, let me tell you something cool about our friends over at Noble Knight Games. They have a killer buy, sell, and trade program going on. And if you want to know more about that, check out nobleknight.com/buy, sell, trade. This is a great way for you to unload some of those games that maybe you don't love as much as you should, but somebody else would love it even more. Or if you've got a collection you're dying to get rid of to make more space, check out nobleknight.com/buy-sell-trade for more information on that. Otherwise, it's time to get a discount, and a killer discount at that. So 10% off any order of $10 or more, running from October the 12th through November the 11th, from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. Happy Halloween from the Vintage RPG Podcast.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. I asked if he ever was into going to a masquerade ball, and he said, why would I ever cover such a handsome face? Stu Horvath.
That one's not true, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think so either. They don't know land, Stu, and I didn't have a whole lot to work with here. How you doing today, Stu?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I can't complain. Why don't you tell our listeners what we're talking about today?
I figured, we're like 80-something episodes in. We should probably talk about one of the biggest games in the 90s, Vampire the Masquerade.
Ooh, this was almost my first foray into role-playing, but I said nah at the time because I didn't really understand what it was about. So, Stu, why don't we tell our listeners a little bit more about Vampire the Masquerade?
So I think that Vampire the Masquerade is kind of like a watershed moment in role-playing games because it's the first time the tent gets bigger, right, for people playing. Because like up until now, it was always like a certain type of person was interested in playing a certain type of game, which was basically Dungeons and Dragons. And no other game really pierced through that shield that D&D had raised around the hobby. You play Dungeons and Dragons first, and then you find other weirder games, but like no other game really brings people into the hobby up until this point. Vampire the Masquerade kind of changes that, flips it, and sort of strikes at a moment of increasing weakness for TSR, where their market share is sort of shrinking. You can kind of see that, like, even though they have like really exciting stuff like Dark Sun and Planescape, there's still something that seems crotchety and old-fashioned about it compared to Vampire the Masquerade, which is very of the moment. It really embraces like an aesthetic of goth punk. This is 1991, so like that's still sort of a thing. It continues to be a thing for several more years, and it brings in just a completely different group of players because it has this goth punk vibe. It attracts goth punk sort of people to play it, and those are people who weren't necessarily ever playing Dungeons and Dragons in the past. So you have this influx of new people, and it has a much more adult sensibilities. D&D was never for kids, but they tried to market it to kids through the cartoon and other ways. There was always this idea that if you get them young, you can, continue to sell games to them as they get older. Vampire the Masquerade is the mature audience's game, so, it's just going right after the adults, and that's a different approach. And it becomes one of the few games to have rivaled Dungeons & Dragons' supremacy in the space, because they just pushed Dungeons & Dragons TSR's market share, and White Wolf, the publisher, just became this massive publisher. And then, of course, it all collapses and, disappears, comes back, gets reimagined a million times, and, how it does. But for one brief moment in the mid-90s, it looked like D&D was going to die and Vampire the Masquerade was going to take over, and it was a really strange moment in time.
And that moment in time in the mid-90s was when a young Hambone first encountered Dungeons & Dragons and other types of role-playing games, mostly Vampire the Masquerade. Now, remember, in 1991 when this happened, most of the world at large, at least in the state of New Jersey, only really knew about Dungeons & Dragons. And everybody knew about Dungeons & Dragons. We remember it from the cartoons as a kid. We knew people who played Dungeons & Dragons, but the idea of any other games outside of D&D was board games like Monopoly, Life, things that Milton Bradley was putting out around the time. At this point, I was approached by some cool older kids who were like, hey, you should come play this game with us. It's called Vampire the Masquerade. And I mean, it was 1991. I wasn't really fully understanding what the idea of a game was outside of a game that didn't exist on a board or on my Nintendo. So I politely declined. Fast forward to about 1994, 1995. Now, at this point, I am fully immersed in a very burgeoning music scene in New Jersey. And a lot of the cool older goth kids were playing Vampire the Masquerade. And at that point, I was a little more open to the idea of trying something that didn't exist on a game board and didn't exist on my Nintendo, except by that point, they had taken it a step further and they were LARPing it. And they were actually doing it at like the seedy motels down in Belleville and in cemeteries at night and like cutting themselves with like cheese graters. And that in 1994-95 was a wee bit above my pay grade, so I politely declined again. And so that was my very first near miss with role-playing games.
So I think that that's a really interesting story because you see right there how it's bringing like a completely different set of people in to play a game in a completely different way than what I'm or you're comfortable with. And I think that's cool. So yeah, Vampire the Masquerade is the first of many World of Darkness games. Comes out in 1991. I don't think you can understate the impact of the cover of the rule book, which is just a slab of bluish marble with a rose on it. It just is completely unlike any other role-playing game cover up to that point. You know, it was in comic books. I think that it was just something that like caught people's attention and screamed, "This is different," without being like too much or ostentatious. Like up until this point, if you put out a new role-playing game, you hired Larry Elmore to do your cover painting because you're going to sell books that way. That's why Shadowrun has a Larry Elmore painting, even though like you would argue that, you know, Larry Elmore isn't really a good fit aesthetically for Shadowrun, but it doesn't matter. You put Larry Elmore on the cover because you want to sell books. This is a completely different strategy, and it sold books. And Vampire the Masquerade is basically, you know, you play vampires. It uses something called the Storyteller system. I believe it's a dice pool sort of system. Every time I try and learn it, like, I get it, I understand it, but, like, it vaporizes out of my brain. And, like, I looked it up yesterday, and I was just like, okay, I understand this. And, like, already I'm just like, I don't really remember how to play. That's a problem because we're going to record a podcast on this. But, you know, it doesn't matter. It's a fairly simple mechanic. It's skill-based dice pool, sort of like Star Wars, which is interesting because Mark Rein-Hagen and Stuart Weick, who are, you know, the founders of White Wolf. Mark Rein-Hagen is the guy who designed Vampire the Masquerade. They both worked on Star Wars material right before founding White Wolf. And a lot of the money that they made freelancing for West End Games is the money that they used to start the company. So it's interesting that there's like echoes of the West End Games Star Wars system in Vampire the Masquerade. There's a huge amount of lore. There's clans. All of this stuff is very famous and interesting if you're into that. I could kind of read Vampire World of Darkness lore forever. I'm not sure that is testament to its quality. There's so much of it, and it doesn't really matter in terms of the game, at least in the inception. I think the inception of the game was very much, you're sort of like a working stiff vampire. You're not like one of these crazy clan leaders. You're not really embroiled in the politics or the war against the werewolves or all of this stuff. You're just a vampire trying to get by and trying to like be cool without losing your humanity. If you lose your humanity, you give in to the beast and you're taken out of play, basically. All World of Darkness games have this binary where you have like, you know, your power versus like being overwhelmed by your power. And in this one, it's your vampirism versus your humanity. And over time, you know, there's a huge meta story in the game. So there's like a million clans. All of them hate each other or kind of like each other, but mostly hate each other and try and kill each other. And then there's like these organizations like the Sabbat, which they're like devil-worshipping crazy vampires who really want to embrace the beast. There's the Camarilla, which is sort of like your Anne Rice type vampires who are just like, oh, we just want to hide amongst humanity and enjoy decadent life, and we don't want to get involved with all this stuff. And there's all this stuff. There's like an alternate history of the world. The idea that there's like this secret society of vampires that is, parasitically living in the shadows. And it's all interesting, and it becomes like a kind of different game over time. I feel like it never feels like a horror game to me, which is weird, right? Because it's a vampire game. But to me, it really grabs some sort of like cyberpunk-like aesthetic and feels, in terms of play, like a superhero game, where you're low-level superheroes that happen to not be able to hang out in the sunlight. And again, I always go back to this, but like horror is about isolation and having your power taken from you and, helplessness. And becoming a vampire is not horror. Just like the Anne Rice books that are super popular right now and sort of fuel interest in this game. They're not horror. They're romance novels, right?
Oh, yeah, they're definitely horny old grandma books. Yeah. For sure.
And everybody's like, banging. Everybody, every which way. And like that's the focus of the books, that and the fact that like they're undead and they live forever, and there's like the whole set of like weird concerns that you map onto the romance thing, and that makes it like an interesting and compelling series of books. And the same thing is true here, except it's not romance. They're explicitly non-sexual, the vampires in Vampire the Masquerade. Like they get nothing out of it. It's just like eating. Like they don't have to eat anymore. They don't need to screw. So you have like this different set of preconceptions that you're working with that are different from humanity, but like you're still just kind of trying to get by and, hang out at the club, have a good time, make sure that your friends are cool and not die. And that's why like the LARP thing works, right? Because like Vampire the Masquerade is a game about basically hanging out and being like gossipy about like the other folks.
Yeah, it's like the world's most popular upkeep game. Because I'll tell you, in 1998, when I was approached for the third time to play Vampire the Masquerade, I mean, this is like hot on the heels of Buffy the Vampire Slayer being everything. And I was approached to play this game, and they said, what do you think? And I said, well, I was like, I would love to. I am so amped to be a vampire slayer. And literally, you could hear the record scratch in the back of the room. They're like, but no, it doesn't work that way. And I'm like, well, how does it work? And then they handed me the game book. And it is a RPG tome like every other one, where it's a textbook, essentially. And granted, it looked like it could pass as a Depeche Mode album cover, but I couldn't get past all the text. And I was like, but I want to be a vampire hunter. They're like, well, it's more about just existing as a vampire. I was like, well, I don't want to exist as a vampire. I want to do the thing. And that was the time I thrice denied those who came to me to play Vampire the Masquerade. It just didn't really sink in for me. Now, that being said, I think this game is so important because up until this point, it was only Dungeons and Dragons. Those words were the cultural lexicon for RPGs, was Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. This came along and challenged everything because when it came along, it became this absolute subcultural zeitgeist where suddenly people are talking about a game that's not Dungeons and Dragons when it comes to rolling dice and RPGs. And in fact, I know many people who had heard of Vampire the Masquerade and understood what it was before they really grasped and grokked Dungeons and Dragons. And also, I think it's an important game as well because I did thumb through the book. And a lot of stuff that you see pop up in this book and a lot of things that you hear about from learning and knowing about the book crossed over into popular culture. I mean, you had Gangrel as a WWF at the time wrestler. Yeah. It redefined the way that people imagined and saw vampires and treated vampires in their worlds and in their stories. So this is an incredibly important book because for the first time since Dracula, the rules about being a vampire kind of changed a little bit, and maybe didn't fully change, but there was a pivot, and it became a cultural phenomenon.
I don't think you can understate the impact of Tim Bradstreet's art in the second edition of Vampire the Masquerade. He just nails it in such an amazing way. And Bradstreet's like Elmore. He was just everywhere. He was in Shadowrun. He's in Dark Conspiracy. He's definitely in Torg. So he's everywhere. But like in Vampire the Masquerade, he does this really great job of making vampires seem possible, I guess is the word. Because they dress like you and me, right? Like, Dracula's awesome, but Dracula also wears a cape and he's got that medallion thing and he looks like a Dracula.
He looks exactly like a Dracula. You know he owns properties somewhere, and probably multiple properties at that. And here you are, a kid from the suburbs. Maybe you have like a cool shop in Montclair that you can go to where you can get your goth clothes.
Yeah.
But that's about it. You're not buying off the rack at JCPenney.
Even Lestat, there's like a frilliness to the clothing, and they're so old and tied to other periods of history, like that removes them from you. But like in Vampire the Masquerade, you're relatively new. You're like a young vampire. New characters are under 100 years old. You're just around, and you wear a leather jacket. A lot of the aesthetic is lifted directly from Near Dark, I think.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. No doubt.
Totally. And like, if there's any question about what you think Sabbat vampires are like, it's the Near Dark vampires. That's what they want to be.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about the things that really redefined vampirism. It would be Near Dark and Vampire the Masquerade.
Yeah, and it just brings it to like this very much more plausible kind of feeling for vampires. In Near Dark, with the fact that they have the outfits so that they can go around during the day, but they're not good, you know?
Yeah.
Vampire has that same kind of like feel. And like, I feel like all the vampires have jobs that they have to worry about. Like, because they still got to pay rent. It's not like they get to live in some coffin, right? Like, they have an apartment.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of liken the vampire day job aspect of Vampire the Masquerade to something like Colin Robinson in What We Do in the Shadows, a TV series where he's the energy vampire hanging out in an office because, yeah, sure, he is a vampire, but nonetheless, the dude's got to pay rent and cable ain't free.
It's so true. I love that kind of like indie movie grounding for vampires. And that makes it more interesting when like War with the Werewolves. Like, what?
Yeah.
Crap. Like, I'm just doing my shift at the 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
And now I got to fight vampires. And I feel like that's the vampire game that I want to play. That's definitely not the vampire game that, like, Vampire really became, because Vampire becomes much more preoccupied with all of the wild lore and the meta that winds up with the end of the world. The whole idea of the Masquerade is that, you know, the vampires want to coexist. They want to blend in so that they're not noticed by humanity. Yeah, and then the meta just keeps getting weirder and wilder, and the stakes get higher. And there's like this whole crazy apocalypse thing that takes place across all of the lines. You know, you have Werewolf, Wraith the Oblivion, Mummy. There's mummies.
Of course there is. Why wouldn't there be?
The Hunter, the Reckoning. So you could have eventually played your Vampire Hunter. Mage, Changeling. There's like so many. And they all sort of have the same flavor of storytelling and system, but they're all totally different power levels and totally incompatible. So you can't mix and match the systems, which I think is really weird and funny.
That makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, like, because like vampires are pretty low power, despite them being vampires and being cool. If you put a vampire up against a mage from Mage the Ascension, like a mage could just like turn you to dust. And like a low level mage, like a starting mage, totally overpowers a vampire. And it's weird to have these things coexist, but like they all coexist like in this weird silo where like each particular slice of the world of darkness doesn't really overlap much.
Yeah, we exist together in the meta, but don't play together.
Exactly. And the werewolf connection early on sort of is downplayed almost immediately because they realize, we're going to make another game out of this. And the werewolves of Werewolf the Apocalypse are different than the werewolves that you see trying to invade Milwaukee.
Oh, because of course, why not?
Well, yeah, like one of the first city books, I think the first city book is Chicago by Night, and then the second or third, I think New York is second, and then the third one is Milwaukee by Night. And it's just like, what? Really? Serious?
That kind of feels like where like Moon Knight would hang out. Like, of all places, like, what is your city to protect? I hang out in Milwaukee.
But that's the thing. It's like Chicago is like this sexy city, and you would think that like the next one would be New Orleans because like that's like the Anne Rice city, but they don't. They go to Milwaukee, and that makes me want that slice of life vampire story. Like, I know Jim Jarmusch did eventually like make a really bad vampire movie that wasn't at all what I wanted, but like I wanted Vampire to be my role-playing engine for making a Jim Jarmusch vampire movie.
Oh my god. Yeah. Jesus Christ. That makes so much sense.
Like long takes, nobody says anything for a long time, and like you just watch a guy making a cup of coffee. You know?
Yeah.
All right, that's the session, guys. Good time. See you next week. But the lore becomes ridiculous and awesome. I love the lore. I just find it very difficult to use the lore as a utility in the actual running of vampire game. Like, there's just too much of it. But, like, all of it's super interesting. There's, like, an alternate creation myth. You know, Cain is, of course, the first vampire, and there's all these ancients. And a lot of Underworld, the Underworld series, poaches from Vampire the Masquerade, wantonly. Like the whole concept of like ancients and the war against the werewolves is like all like very first edition Vampire the Masquerade. And then this stuff totally bled into people's lives. Like I never was 100% sure that it was a role-playing thing, but there was vampire courts in a lot of the cities of the United States in the 90s and early 2000s.
Say what?
Yeah, so this is something I find extremely fascinating. But in New York, there weren't dedicated goth clubs anymore, really. There were goth nights at a bunch of different clubs. And one place that had a goth night was the Slaughtered Lamb.
That makes so much sense. But go on.
It's like a novelty horror restaurant in the Village. And they had an upstairs room where they would do a club night. But before the club night would happen, I think it was once a month, there was a meeting of the Vampire Court, which was the vampire rulers of New York. And part of this comes out of just like overfixation on, Anne Rice fandom. But also I think that part of it was sort of fueled by like a little bit of Vampire the Masquerade roleplay. But I think that those two groups didn't necessarily know. Like I think the Vampire the Masquerade people thought everybody was playing Vampire the Masquerade. But like, these other people were just like, no, we're taking this much more seriously. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, their idea night court and my idea night court are two wildly different kind of parties, sounds like.
Yeah. But yeah, so there's this whole like other level of reality that Vampire the Masquerade kind of brings and was brought into other things. The New York court still meets. I know that is still a thing. And I know that there were courts in other cities. And I know that people live action role played in their goth scenes. I've heard some stories of some stuff that happened in Australian cities. And it's interesting and fun. I would have been mortified to participate, but I love hearing the stories.
Me too.
Like, I just love the idea of like a bunch of goth kids like pretending that they're really vampires. It's like a perfectly 90s thing.
Oh, it's so on brand for the 90s. Like, I don't think, and this is in no way me looking down on it, because I think that if you are into something, it's the coolest thing in the world. If you're into something and you love it so passionately, then I want to hear about it, and I want to celebrate your passion for the things that you love. So if Vampire the Masquerade was your thing, awesome. That rules, and you rule too. And that being said, I don't know that it would have gotten off the ground and taken over the way it did had it come out even 5 years later than it did.
Yeah.
I think that it came out at exactly the right place and time where the world was right where it needed to be and open to something like this. Because I think, 5 years later, as goth and grunge started to wane and it became more pop punk over the airways, I think there's, a lot to be said about what the music scenes were like around this time and kind of what was popular and what people were kind of getting into, and how in the early 90s, people were kind of really starting to dig their fingers into the underground, and more people were open to doing that. I know that 10 years from when it happened, it never probably would have gotten off the ground and taken over and become such a subcultural phenomenon like it did. It's a perfect storm at a time and place that we're never going to get back.
I mean, yeah, if it was 10 years later, it would have been called Emo the Saddening.
Stu!
What? I mean, it would have.
Yeah. Oh, my God.
Yeah.
You told a joke, and it killed me.
And on that note, I think I don't have anything else to say about Vampire the Masquerade.
I mean, we're going home with it. I can barely breathe. Folks, this is an awesome episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. I'm sure we're going to talk about Vampire the Masquerade again more in the future. But for now, Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, talking about stuff this week, actually. I got Milwaukee by Night up.
And it won't be involving me choking so much.
Yeah, no, it's far less funny than that one joke.
You could find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about board games. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons and Dragons. You can follow my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and in life over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really help other listeners to find us. If you really like the show, head on over to patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got early release episodes. We've got videos. We've got behind-the-scenes looks at Stu's book and my game. And also, we got a great Discord community over there as well. So definitely check out patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.